Good evening. Thank you so much for coming out this evening, and thank you for the dual patience and resilience to both be here for the film and watch that story unfold before your very eyes, and then to be willing to stay after all of that, because that's an emotionally draining experience, to be willing to stay after that to participate in this part of the program, because I'm about to ask you to do stuff. There are two things I want to point out. First, I want to say thank you to Linda for such a kind introduction. I usually use a different line when I talk about where I went to high school. I think it's really important, and it's especially in some ways related to this evening's program. I am, yes, a proud graduate of Tulsa's Booker T. Washington High School, and I graduated from there before it was a magnet school. My father is a proud graduate, was a proud graduate of Langston University. I did not attend there, but I did participate in a number of programs there while I was in high school, and have been back there several times to visit and do research. I conducted part of my dissertation research at Langston. I'm sure that all of you are familiar with Langston, and I suspect that in Stillwater, I don't have to do the did you know thing about how Langston and Oklahoma State University are related. So thank you for that question, and my father did graduate from there. Whenever attention is brought to the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot, I think two things occur. First, if people have heard the entire story as you have this evening, people are emotionally drained. It's hard to confront, from either side of the story, it's hard to confront that events like that populate our past as a nation. It becomes harder when we consider that we're talking about events that populate our past as a state. And it becomes even harder as we bring that even closer to home and think about it happened in Tulsa, not very far from here, maybe where some of you have relatives who lived there in Tulsa during that time. And it happened in the hardest ways, I think, to imagine. It happened in neighborhoods. It happened in places where it happened in a place where the people who perpetrated the event lived, and where the people on whom the event was spent lived. And I think that's something that bears our attention. One of the ways that things like that happen, I believe, is when people don't know each other. The restrictions of Jim Crow racial segregation kept us from knowing each other. They would have made it illegal for us to be gathered in this room together. That would not have happened. They also made it uncomfortable, even if we were in other settings on a regular basis. If my relative worked for your relative, or if I worked for you, or if my kids worked for your kids, it would not have been appropriate for us to spend time and know each other. So we're going to take a little bend on that this evening. Some of you probably already know each other, but I'm going to pretend, since I don't know you, that you don't know each other either. Would you stand up, please? Would you turn to someone that you don't know, someone that you didn't come with, and introduce yourself, and tell them something about what you got out of watching the film. This is going to take about 5 minutes. This is not just simple, my name is Mary. So tell them something you got out of the film, to someone that you're just introducing yourself to. When people get to talking. It makes it unthinkable that acts of violence could occur between people who can talk with each other. So I ask you to carry forward with this idea, carry it past here, and for the next, I don't know, week, several days at least, talk to people. Speak to people in the grocery store, speak to people on the campus, speak to people who come into the library, or speak to people. This is a hard one. Speak to the people you don't know at your church. That's one that's hard for people. I went to a church when I lived in Muskogee, I went to a church that had two services. We had a 9 o'clock service, we had an 8 o'clock service, and we had an 11 o'clock service. And in the summer, we had one 9 o'clock service. And for the first 3 weeks, there were people incensed from both groups who were angry because someone greeted them and said, "It's so nice to have you visit our church." And they'd be incensed. I mean, we were wound up with the group that we knew. But the other people, not so much. So I would encourage you over the next week to make it your business to carry forward the idea of communicating with people you don't know. I don't think that worry about the likelihood of an event like the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot has to be part of your everyday thinking. But I do think that we as a state and as a nation, as part of the planet, we do run pretty considerable risks when we just get narrowly focused with the people we know. We have to know what's happening outside our sphere. We absolutely have to. So make that your summer challenge. We're right on the cusp of summer. So let's make that our summer challenge. We're going to talk to people, we're going to get to know people. We're going to build the network here in Stillwater that will prevent the kind of communication breakdown that leads to social mayhem. I was asked to talk a little bit about Tulsa now and about the impact of the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot on Tulsa. I think that some of what was said in the film, though, addresses some things that we probably need to know but don't necessarily often think about. There was a comment that was made about businesses often being named so-and-so and sons, showing the generations of participation in that business. And it's true that when that cycle is stopped abruptly, you don't have so-and-so sons or so-and-so daughters. You don't have so-and-so as generations passed, and it's a father and a son-in-law, or a father and a daughter-in-law, or a mother and a daughter-in-law. You don't get to have that. And so you don't see very much of that in Tulsa, at least among businesses that are owned by people who would have survived from the black side of the race riot. I want to also make a comment that is also about commerce. I think it's important to tell the story of the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot with a piece of information that is not emphasized in this film. And that is that by 1935, the people who survived and stayed in Tulsa were still required to live in the Greenwood District because Jim Crow law put them there in the first place. But by 1935, those people had rebuilt their community. They didn't get insurance payments. They didn't get a note from the federal government and a check. They didn't get special rates at the bank. They didn't get any kind of help from outside their community. but their own commitment to a better life, which is also what brought them to Tulsa in the first place. Their own commitment to their families and the good of their families pushed them to get their families out of the temporary housing in which they lived after the race riot, pushed them to restore both dignity, people, and commerce in the Greenwood district. So if you come, and this is an invitation, if you come to the Greenwood Cultural Center and to visit John Hope Franklin, you saw him in the film, John Hope Franklin Reconciliation Park, we will be able to show you photographs, not only of what happened during the race riot, but photographs of the rebuilt district. Now, when you consider that the district was rebuilt and was rebuilt by the people who had suffered the horror, I think in some ways that makes an even stronger case for somebody ought to do something. Someone should do or make a stance on something related to the recognition of resilience. The resilience it took to get out of the tents, to build buildings, to create homes, to give everyone a place to stay is incredible. And I think when you tell the story from that perspective too, you give a lot of well-deserved credit to the survivors. And I think that's really important. So can we take a second and give a hand to the people who survived and rebuilt their communities? I grew up in Tulsa. By the time I was born, the race riot was a bit of history. It wasn't talked about. It's still not talked about. I just met someone who said that she grew up in Skytook, which is not very, did I say that properly? Okay. Which is not very far from Tulsa. And in fact, I've heard stories that Skytook was one of the places that people walked to, and I've read this, that people walked to when they tried getting out of Tulsa and headed north. Just, I gotta get away from here. Something bad's gonna happen to me. It's already happened to some of my family, to my property. I've gotta get away from here. And some people walk to Skytook. Now, in the world of 2016, that's almost unthinkable. I mean, they have cars now. And a 15-mile walk is not something someone would embark on easily. But when you think about the world of 1921, and you take away the cars and you take away the expressway and you realize that to walk that 15 miles was to walk through thicket, was to walk across some waters 2 or 3 different times probably, and to really be, I mean, you really had to be getting away from something to make that choice. And those people, so there are some people who made that choice to leave that way and go north. Some of them continued walking. I was just talking with somebody who told me that they had relatives who had actually walked into Kansas, getting away from the race riot in Tulsa. They were so determined that they ended up walking all the way to Kansas, which is a long, long way. But if you don't have a train ticket and you don't have a car, that was the way to get around. That was one way to get around. Commerce in Tulsa, this is a funny story, I think, and I don't want to offend anybody. So, is anybody here in Leadership Oklahoma Class 29? For real, that's this year's class. Okay. So, Leadership Oklahoma, of which I was a member a billion years ago, because I was a member of Class 8. Leadership Oklahoma came to Tulsa about a month ago. And they brought the class, the current class, and every time a city hosts a class, they have to pick a topic. So the topic for Tulsa was economic development. So when I first saw that, I thought, well, this is gonna be deep. I gotta be part of this. So I called up and said, I'm gonna be part of the host committee thing because I'm really old and I was a long ago veteran of Leadership Oklahoma, but I'm really curious about this, how this topic's gonna be handled in Tulsa. And then I found out that the session was going to be held at OSU Tulsa. Does everybody know where that is in Tulsa? It's on Greenwood Avenue. It's in the original historic Greenwood district. Well, I missed a couple of meetings, and guess what? We managed to have a whole day's worth of session about economic development. And not a single person of color was a speaker. There were no black people, there were no Asian people, there were no, I think there may have been one Native American person. Yeah. Nobody whose ethnicity falls generally into the category of people of color was a speaker. And I was surprised. So when I was asked to give a toast at the end, final session, I said, I just want to say, I think it took a lot of work and a lot of effort to do it, but our group did me proud today. We came up with a way to do something I didn't think would be possible to do. We were in the historic Greenwood district, and we managed to miss the whole story of Black Wall Street. Just want everybody to realize there was a whole story missed in your session today, and then I proceeded to tell the story. Because I didn't want anybody to leave without knowing you know the story because of the film. Tulsa today is that community. I thought that accomplishment pretty much reflected where we were. Nobody thought about it. I would ask you, I would charge you actually, you've seen this movie now. You've seen this documentary. There are only a tiny few small, less than 10 people left. They started out with nearly 200. There are less than 10 left, and that's the generous, I don't know all their names, story, part count. Probably less than 10. But if nobody thinks about it, if nobody says, how do we have a gathering and call it good and look around and see only people who look like us, and that's only like any of us, that's how do we have a gathering that is just African American people and call it a really good gathering when no one else was represented in the group, and we can always learn from somebody. We can always learn something from somebody. How do we have a gathering that's only Caucasian people and declare, this is great. This is everybody that needs to be here. How do we have that without realizing there are some other voices that are probably needed in whatever we were doing? How do we do that? I would charge you and encourage you as you're talking with people in various settings, I would encourage you to think about, how do we include everybody? How do we make sure that everybody is represented in all of the things that we do? That mindfulness is what makes a difference. That mindfulness is an important piece. And as we think about Tulsa, how the race riot impacts Tulsa, I would say to you that one of the ways that Tulsa is impacted is that Tulsa remains a city that can be very divided. Tulsa remains a city where clumps of people gather and everybody's just alike. And nobody necessarily seeks to include or even thinks to include people who might be different, who might make it possible for there to be genuine diversity in a setting. And I encourage you to think about ways that you, because we all have to act where we can as individuals, ways that you might be able to impact that in the settings where you exist. You don't have to go outside and find some new people necessarily. You don't have to do that. But how do you make a way to invite people? You meet them in the grocery store line. I've already asked you to do that. So then you can ask them to go someplace. True story. About 2 weeks ago, maybe 3, the evening of the Buck Colbert Franklin lecture in Tulsa, University of Tulsa Big Deal lecture. And the gentleman who was talking was the vice president at the University of Southern California, Los Angeles. He's really neat. He's talking about implicit bias. Everybody aware of implicit bias? Okay. Implicit bias is what we're thinking when we don't realize we're thinking it. It's all about how we're telling ourselves one story, but we're thinking something very different. We're saying to ourselves, I like everybody, but we're thinking, I really don't like blue sweaters. And if you're wearing a blue sweater, I probably am a little leery of you because I've never liked blue sweaters. But that's just that's one track in your mind, but your voice that you're speaking out loud and your actions are, I love everybody. Your implicit biases are showing when you listen to the inner voice inside your head. So he's, Jared, the vice president for UCLA is coming to talk about that. Well, I'm at the center where I work, and I see a young man, and he wants a tour. And I'm trying to get to this lecture on time, because I'm never on time for anything. And I'm trying to pick up kids, I've got somebody delivering a kid, I've got to go back to the high school to pick up another kid, and I'm just past available to do a tour. And I catch myself, because I try to be pretty nice, so I catch myself thinking, I'm not gonna make eye contact, because if I make eye contact, I'm gonna end up giving the tour, and then I'm gonna be late, and the day goes up, it just goes to pot. So, I didn't make eye contact. The young man comes in the office, and I'm thinking, oh, now this is really gonna be a bust, because I'm not giving this tour. My inner voice is, I'm not giving this tour. I'm just not giving this tour. So I say to him, when he opens his mouth to say he wants the tour, I say, well, listen, I don't have time for a tour, but why don't you come go with me? I've never met this man before in my life. And I said, why don't you just come go with me? And he gave me that look that people give to older women who invite younger men to go do stuff. And I could tell he's so fine, but he kind of gathered, he was pretty cool. He gathered himself back together and he said, where are you going? And I said, I'm going to the Buck Colbert Franklin lecture at the University of Tulsa. You should go, it's free. Who are you? Are you from Tulsa? And he said, no, he was from Washington, D.C. And I said, well, that's okay, I won't hold it against you. If you come back tomorrow, I'll give you the tour. But right now, I'm trying to get to this lecture. You should come go with me. Well, he went. Imagine that. So yeah, I mean, he went. Well, it turns out, my guy is the communications director for the senator, the U.S. senator from Oklahoma who is not from the Tulsa area. So not only have I met my goal of inclusion, I've also crossed a barrier that I'm encouraging everybody to cross with this whole talk in the grocery store line thing. I've crossed a political barrier, because we're talking conservative, and I turn out to be, among my friends, the most progressive person with the most conservative contacts. Because it turns out I also know someone in Congressman Bridenstine's office. You work someplace long enough, you know everybody, they do divergent kinds of things, and suddenly you have a diverse crowd of folks that are your in crowd, they're your group. And I encourage everybody to seek that out. Tulsa didn't have that, doesn't always have it now, most of the time doesn't have it now. That's what we lack. We lack knowing people who are not us. Stories such as the one told in this documentary, I think, highlight what happens when we don't know each other. It makes it possible for us to be cruel. It makes it possible for us to be unbearable. It makes it possible for us to ignore the pain that we may have caused decades later. Not knowing those people, I thought Mrs. Gates, the lecturer, did a phenomenal job of talking about the airplane issue, whether or not there were airplanes and incendiary devices that were dropped in the race riot. There's another school of thought. I am a graduate of Oklahoma State University College of Education. There's another whole school of thinking that I picked up while I was there in classes about qualitative research and about validity. And if we don't consider the witnesses, we don't consider the participants valid, we don't have a research project worth conducting. So when we're talking with people, when they were talking with people about what happened in the race riot and the people who were there in the Greenwood district as fire was dropping out of the sky, because they were not considered valid eyewitnesses, because they were not really considered valid people, because they were African American. The stories about fire coming out of the sky were questioned. People had to do inventories of were there even airplanes available to have something like that happen? And if there were airplanes, was it possible to do dropping something out of them without burning up the airplanes? And it turned into a big science deal. I'm willing to guess that had there been other witnesses, those eyewitness recounts might have been assessed differently, and the story might have been told in a different way. So in the end, I encourage everybody to reach out, make your crowd diverse, the people that you talk with, the people that you get to know, the people that you listen to. See how they're living in the world and think about that. It doesn't have to change what you do, but it will change the way you think, which may change what you do ultimately. But it won't immediately have to change you. And be mindful of discounting, folks. Be mindful of the implicit biases and the explicit biases that allow us to discount people around us. Lift up the people who deserve to be lifted up, which is everybody breathing. And be kind to one another. Be thoughtful in our interactions with everybody else, as we would have them be in their interactions with us. I think that if any one of us were a judge who had an opportunity to make a decision about reparations even now, rather than simply saying, you know, the statute of limitations has run out on this, as if they didn't have an ounce of history in them, I think that most of us, especially now, would be willing to talk more about what constitutes reparations and how do we do about trying to do something that is reasonable recognition of the valor that it may have taken to live through horror times and rebuild communities, those same people. I think we would want to do that. I encourage you, if you don't think that that's true, I encourage you to kind of think along those lines to see what we might need to do to think differently. It's been my pleasure to be here this evening with you. I was determined not to be Debbie Downer about the film, because I can be. I see those things, I can't explain them to myself. I get in that spiral, commiserating and feeling horrible. And I don't think that pushes us anywhere. I don't think that pushes us up in any way. I don't think that that pulls us up. And I'm all about we need to live in the here and now, and we need to live pleasantly. I've gotten old enough to know that we don't get to live all that long. So we need to enjoy it. And I encourage you to enjoy it in the company of new people. Whatever time, just enjoy it in the company of new people, being open-minded with those people. I'll take a question or two. Just if you've got a comment, come up and we'll talk about it. If you've got a question, I can deal with questions. Anybody have any questions you want to ask? Yes, ma'am.
I just have a question as far as, obviously there's been great detail as far as hoping to get the survivor stories, but what has been done as far as getting those survivors' families' stories and the impact that it had on them generations later, whether that be positive or negative as far as the impact, whether it lifted them up and that kind of thing?
Thank you, that's a great question. The question is what's been done to get information about survivors' families. I am a graduate of the OSU College of Education. I completed a qualitative research dissertation. Dr. Pauline Harris, who is also a graduate of the OSU College of Education, completed a qualitative dissertation. She is a board member for the John Hope Franklin Center. We have what we call a documentary studies project. It is a qualitative research project. Our research question is, how did your family deal with information, or how did your family pass information about the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot? And it's a question that we're asking of all kinds of people. We have recorded interviews, and we continue to record interviews. We're on hiatus for the last year with the recordings because we hope to put them online. We have created a place on our website where we will be able to put up the interviews even as we're finishing up one round of the project. But we are collecting those interviews. One of the things that I think some people assumed when the John Hope Franklin Center said that we were going to do a research project, I think a lot of people assumed that we were going to only talk with families of African American people. And that is not the design of our study. Our study is anybody who was in the Tulsa area. If you tell me that your great-grandparents lived in Tulsa, I'm gonna wanna know how did your family talk about it. And part of that is because I think that everybody who lived, we all think, that everybody who lived in Tulsa constitutes a person who survived the race riot. And this is kind of gory when I say it out loud, but it's what I think. If it wasn't my house that burned, it was the ashes from my house that came in the windows at your house and made you have to clean it up or have someone come in to clean it up. So we were both impacted by the race riot, regardless of where we lived. People didn't have air conditioning. Their windows were not closed. The smoke was blowing around. It was either mass stuff somewhere in your house or it was in everybody's house. So our research project covers everybody. So if you let me know, who knows, you give me enough information, we'll be calling you. Want to come talk to us? Want us to come talk with you, please? We've got cameras, we're ready.
When were you first told about the race riot?
I was first told about the race riot at Booker T. Washington High School in a history class that was taught by Bertha McIntyre. Bertha McIntyre was a teacher whose family, I believe, had lived in Tulsa during the time of the race riot. And Mrs. McIntyre did not hold the standard history curriculum for high school in high esteem. So how about that? We had a unit about the race riot. We had a unit about all kinds of religions, and that certainly wasn't what they intended. She taught the history that she thought people needed to know, and that was when I first heard about the race riot.
What year was that?
That would have been probably 1967 or 8. It was a long time ago. Nobody talked about it. One of the things that I don't think they mentioned in the film, one of the things that Eddie Faye Gates, the researcher, found as she conducted a round of interviews in the late 1990s, early 2000s, she found that race riot survivors talked about not talking about the race riot with their children. They didn't talk about it. And the reason that they said they didn't talk about it was because they didn't want to raise bitter children. They didn't want to raise children who wandered the world looking for the people who burned down Grandma's house. And I will own that they did a marvelous job about it. When Mrs. McIntyre taught about the race riot, most of us just thought she was funning us. We thought she was telling some kind of crazy story. Because the Greenwood district that we knew was not burned down. And most of the time when the story was told, it kind of ended with burning down the district. There was not, what we knew, because when I was a kid, Greenwood was still existing, was still a community of homes and businesses. What we knew was not what she was talking about. So we were rather incredulous. Don Ross talks about when Mr. Williams had told him a few years before that, because he's a little bit older than I am, and he mouthed off in class, I guess, and Mr. Williams brought the book and showed him his scrapbook, and Don Ross saw that, but still had a hard time putting it together with the reality that he knew, because where he knew to go was just not a place that looked like all that destruction and all that burning. But I knew about it a long time before I was involved with the John Hope Franklin Center. Yes, ma'am.
Has the educational system for the state of Oklahoma put that into the history books, and if so, when?
I promise I'm not planting these questions. They're so good. Okay, So Oklahoma, that's an excellent question. Has the education system picked up on teaching about this historic event in Oklahoma? And the answer is yes, sort of. There are 2 state statutes that require public schools to teach about the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot and Black Wall Street. 2. There are 2 of them. The problem is that nobody told the textbook committee. So the law says you're required to teach this. The practical response is we can't teach what we don't know. And occasionally I have met a few people that my implicit biases jumped out, stood on the table and screamed and said, you don't want them teaching. You don't want them teaching this. They might be nuts. Because they were people who were willing to start the conversation that I don't even believe this happened. So what am I supposed to teach? Well, how about I've got a documentary for you to watch. Teach that. But beyond that, if you don't know, then don't teach. Even though at that point, not teaching, you're breaking the law. The John Hope Franklin Center, where I work, our work is all done by volunteers. So every time I tell you something that we're doing, that's a hint at you could come up and volunteer. You could. Or we could do satellite work. You wouldn't even have to come up. You could just say, I want to volunteer, and we'll beam you in. We'll use Skype to get you involved or something. John Hope Franklin Center has a curriculum development project underway. We have some materials, but we have some materials that I left in the car that are bookmarks that we're making about people in Greenwood that we will be giving to people who come to visit our park. But we also, the next step in that curriculum development project is figuring out how do we build the inserts for the textbooks while we're also conversing with the textbook committee people to say something has to be there, because what we think is going to happen is we're going to go talk to them and they're going to turn around and figure they're turning the tables on us and say, well, you want something in there. Where is it? And we want to be able to go here. We want to be ready. So the more expertise we have, everybody in the room, the more expertise we have, the more quickly we will have the insert developed, and we'll be ready to move forward with the conversations. In the meanwhile, the John Hope Franklin Center is taking on the project of helping to do the teaching, and we do that in a number of ways. Every single one of you is now invited. You have an official invitation from me to a docent-led tour of the historic Greenwood District, John Hope Franklin Reconciliation Park, which commemorates the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot, the Greenwood Cultural Center, which houses a collection of materials that commemorate the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot and the Greenwood District overall, and the Mabel B. Little Heritage House, which is an example of one way in which African American people were living in the 1920s in the Greenwood District. Once you come and see all that, we hope that we're sticky. We hope that you'll want to do more things with us, and we'll all get Skype, and we'll all be working together on our issues. But certainly we hope the more people that education occurs in groups. We invite you to come, and then if you're teaching or you have kids, you'll bring kids from your Sunday school one day, or you'll bring kids from your school where you're teaching. You'll bring your friends, and pretty soon more people will know. They'll know the story as a result of having come to see our work. The brochure, the little flyer that we handed out, tells about one of the signature events of the John Hope Franklin Center, and it's coming up. It's just barely a month from now, and it's our 7th annual Symposium on Reconciliation. You met John Hope Franklin himself in the documentary. One of the things that's important to know about Dr. Franklin is that he took a very scholarly, very measured, very considerate approach to everything, including that story that he told about having been approached in his club. Imagine that, you're in your club and somebody walks up and says, "Here, you take my coat." But he took a measured approach to that. He didn't slap her. He took the coat to somebody and asked them to hang it up. And then went on back to his party. But he took a measured approach to things, and so we try to do some of that in emulating him too. And so the symposium every year looks at the idea of reconciliation. How do we bring people together to prevent something like the discord and the lack of communication from the riot from ever happening again? And this year, we are really excited about the lineup that we have arranged for this 2-day symposium. We have Morris Dees, everybody who knows Southern Poverty Law Center. Okay. Morris Dees is our keynote speaker. He will be speaking the evening of May 24th. It's a Wednesday. He will be speaking in a free session. Unless somebody here is ready to be a real benefactor to us and give us about $50,000, we still have bills to pay related to the symposium, so we have a small registration fee. It's $150 for 2 days. Morris Dees, however, is a big enough contribution to the community that we are giving it away. He's speaking on Wednesday evening at the Hyatt Regency. That website will let you register just for the Morris Dees part. We're trying to know about how many people are coming. So please bring all your friends, get buses, bring all your friends. We're also pleased to have on our program Anita Hill and Mark Lewis. I don't know how the Stillwater newspaper has covered the activity with the Tulsa County Sheriff's Office. You've been reading about that? Mark Lewis is the leader for We the People Oklahoma. We the People Oklahoma is the organization that came together to help bring a lot of the discord and improper functioning of the sheriff's office to light. And Mark Lewis is the quintessential activist for our times, and he's on our program, along with David Riggs, who is one of the noted attorneys in Tulsa, and Judge Doris Francine, who is the Chief Juvenile Justice Judge in Tulsa, and Brian Hosmer, who is a noted Western history professor at the University of Tulsa. Along with that, we have concurrent sessions, we have some tours. We're going to go to visit the David L. Moss Criminal Justice Center. It used to be David L. Moss Corrections Center, but it's now Criminal Justice Center, which is the jail in Tulsa. We're also going to visit at Youth Services of Tulsa, and we're going to visit at DVIS, Domestic Violence Intervention Services, on tours. We have a really big program planned, and within the next day or two, that whole schedule will be online. So I hope that you will use that flyer to get a little more information, and I hope that we will see some of you at the symposium. Any more excellent questions? I promise they're not planted.
We can take one more.
One more excellent question. Yes, ma'am.
You can talk to her afterwards.
Survivors and the accomplishments that so many seem to have. And I was just wondering what you know about how did these people come from the ashes and become accomplished?
Resilience.
And so far away, too.
Resilience and a tendency toward getting out of Dodge on the first name leaving. Tulsa as a community, let's start with that. Tulsa as a community began largely with people who were coming to that place to live better lives, and that's in the late 1800s. Those people didn't go anywhere, they just had families. And so most of the families that stayed in Tulsa come from those same roots, those roots of, we didn't just come here to sit down, We came here because coming here offered us an opportunity to do better than we had been doing. And that was Native Americans, that was African Americans, that was even Caucasians who came into this new place. At least for me, when I consider that people came there with that in mind, it's not a surprise that the people who rose up from that turned out to be talented. They had talented ancestors and they were talented too. And it also is not necessarily a surprise that they got out as quickly as they could. John Hope Franklin received an award when he was a senior in high school in 1931, 10 years after the race riot. He was invited to the luncheon. It was a citywide award, and apparently they gave one to everybody at each of the high schools. He was invited to the luncheon where this award was to be bestowed. He was served his lunch in the kitchen.
Oh, God.
Do we blame him for leaving immediately to go to Fisk University? Did we expect him to hang around, want to live around Tulsa, even to go to Langston and hang around, come back to Tulsa every weekend he could? Do we blame him for that? I don't think we do. This is a sad personal story. I learned about it today, so I'm sharing it out. First opportunity I've had. I was talking with John Hope Franklin's son, John Franklin. He lives in Washington. I have an almost aunt who lives in Washington and is known to the Franklins. His wife got on the phone and we started talking about my Aunt Mildred. And she said, "You will not believe what Millie said the last time we were together." And I said, "What?" And she said, she asked me, did we really have a John Hope Franklin Center? Aunt Millie and John Hope Franklin went to school together. She just turned 98. She asked me, was there really a center? Was it really something? Did it really exist? And I told her, yeah. And she said, well, what is Jocelyn doing with it? Isn't she still teaching? And I told her that you weren't teaching, and if you were, it was like one class or something, you were working for the center part-time. And she said, are they paying her money? I guess she wants to keep me out of the middle. And Karen said yes. And then she said, after some more conversation, she said, I never would have thought that could happen in Tulsa. Aunt Mildred grew up, as I said, with John Hope Franklin. She left the same week he did. She didn't come back except once a year. We could count on her showing up once a year around Christmas with lots of stuff and stories of her travels. People left from Tulsa and carried with them, many of the older people who left, carried with them really bitter stories. Karen Franklin unraveled in that same exchange, and some of this is a 90-year-old mind. But our Mildred said, where do you stay when you go to Tulsa every year? You have to stay at somebody's home, right? Because in her Tulsa, in the Tulsa she left from, the hotels had been burned. And the ones that had replaced them, by the time she was really aware, the ones that had replaced them were not necessarily someplace that somebody going back to visit with some oomph about them was going to stay. There were no more super first-class hotels in the Greenwood district, and black people were not allowed to stay at the Mayo. Black people were not allowed to stay at the other hotel, any of the major hotels, local or chain in Tulsa. So in her mind, when Karen and John have been coming every year for the last 5 or 6 years, they've been staying at somebody's house. But she's 98, so her recollections for now and then probably are easily interchanged. But the sadness of that for me today was that that's her memory of home. That's what she took with her when she left in 1931. I think lots of people have left. I think in the generation that I represent, which is, yes, an older generation, but that generation, many of us left, but many of us have come back home to take care of parents, and now we're just too old to leave again, frankly. It's just too hard to pack up all that crap and couldn't get away with it. Loaded down by stuff. If anybody was to come help me clean the house, I'd probably move it. But, frankly, but that tendency, Tulsa has produced amazing folks and sent them out into the world. Sometimes with good, what I was trying to say is sometimes with good memories and sometimes with bad of Tulsa. But there's a lot of talent, and there has always been a lot of talent in that community. Think Alfre Woodard. She grew up right there. And she left as soon as she could. She went to Boston first and then California. She has not lived in Tulsa again. She has brothers and sisters, so she managed to get her parents through their illnesses and their death without having to come back and live. There are a lot of people with that story, and there are a lot of people with the I had to come back and take care of my folks stories. But that's a part of, I mean, resilience is the key to it, to the survivors' stories, for sure. And along with those stories, there's also bad memories will keep you away from someplace and make you go far. Thank you so much for being so welcoming to me this evening. I would be remiss if I didn't recognize the board member from the John Hope Franklin Center who actually made my visit possible. I can't drive at night right now. And so Jeff Koss, who is a member of our board, was kind enough to help me get here and help me get back